Close your eyes and imagine ancient Jerusalem under Roman rule. Armored soldiers controlled the streets and their authority was absolute. But for many women in the city, their presence meant something far more terrifying than just military power. The screams echoed through the narrow streets of Jerusalem as the city's walls finally collapsed. Smoke rose into the sky in thick, black columns, fire spread from house to house with terrifying speed, and the once sacred city transformed into a battlefield of chaos, fear, and unimaginable suffering. It was the year 70 CE, and the mighty Roman army under the command of General Titus had finally conquered Jerusalem after months of brutal, unrelenting siege. The siege itself had been a slow and deliberate act of destruction. 4 months, the Roman legions had encircled the city, cutting off all supplies of food, water, and hope. Inside the walls, the people of Jerusalem had endured starvation, disease, and despair. Families had watched helplessly as their loved ones weakened and perished. The city that had once thrived as the spiritual heart of the Jewish people had become a prison of suffering long before the final walls crumbled. When the breach finally came, the soldiers of the Roman Empire stormed through the shattered gates with overwhelming and merciless force. Their iron armor clanged in terrifying rhythm as they marched through the ruined streets, and their crimson banners waved high above the destruction, symbols of an empire that demanded absolute submission. The disciplined legions moved through Jerusalem like a flood, pouring into every quarter, every alley, and every courtyard. For the people of Jerusalem, this moment marked the end of hope, the end of resistance, the end of their way of life, and for many, the end of life itself. The city descended into absolute pandemonium. Families ran desperately to hide in basements, behind broken walls, inside the ruins of homes and temples, or in underground tunnels that had been carved beneath the city over centuries. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, elderly men and women stumbled through smoke-filled streets searching for shelter, and young men who had fought bravely on the walls now faced the impossible choice of surrender or death. But there was little escape. Roman soldiers were rigorously trained to search every corner, every home, and every hiding place. They moved systematically through the city, breaking down doors, pulling apart debris, and dragging people from the darkest recesses of their shelters. The efficiency of the Roman military machine left almost no one untouched. The destruction reached its most devastating climax when the soldiers set fire to the Second Temple, the holiest site in all of Judaism. Josephus recorded that Titus himself may have wished to spare the temple, but the fury of the soldiers was beyond any single commander's control. The flames consumed the sacred structure, and the gold that adorned its walls melted and ran between the stones. The sight of the temple burning was, for the Jewish people, not merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe of the highest order, a wound that would be mourned for millennia. Among the most vulnerable in this catastrophe were the women of the city. As the Roman army took complete control, many women were violently separated from their families. Some were captured during the chaos of the initial attack, seized in the streets as they fled. Others were dragged from homes where they had tried to hide, torn from the arms of their children or their elderly parents. In the fog of war, with discipline often giving way to savagery, women became targets of the conqueror's unchecked brutality. Ancient historians like Flavius Josephus, who personally witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, described the aftermath as one of the darkest moments in the city's long and tumultuous history. Josephus wrote with a mixture of horror and sorrow, documenting how the conquered population was divided among various fates. Thousands were taken as slaves, marched in chains across vast distances to be sold in markets throughout the Roman Empire. Others were sent to arenas to face gladiators or wild beasts for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The young, the strong, and the beautiful were selected for specific purposes, while the old and the weak were often left to perish. The conquest was not only about defeating an enemy or quelling a rebellion. For many soldiers, it was also about claiming victory through domination, plunder, and absolute control over the defeated population. The spoils of war included not only gold, silver, and sacred artifacts, many of which were paraded through the streets of Rome in a grand triumphal procession, but also human beings reduced to property by the cruel logic of ancient warfare. And sadly, women often suffered the most in these moments of war. Their suffering was rarely recorded in detail by ancient historians, who focused instead on battles, politics, and the deeds of great men. But between the lines of every ancient account of conquest and siege, the silent suffering of women endures, a reminder that the true cost of war is measured not only in fallen soldiers and ruined cities, but in the shattered lives of the most vulnerable. Jerusalem fell, the temple burned, and an entire world was lost in the flames. After the fighting slowed and the last pockets of resistance were crushed, An eerie silence settled over the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem. The clash of swords gave way to the sound of chains. The Roman soldiers, their weapons still stained with the blood of battle, began the systematic and methodical process of gathering prisoners from the ruined city. Thousands of survivors, men, women, children, and the elderly, were captured and forced into large groups under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of heavily armed guards. The people who had once walked freely through the streets of their sacred city now stood huddled together, stripped of their dignity, their possessions, and their freedom. Women were among the largest group of captives. Many had survived the siege by hiding in underground chambers, in the basements of destroyed homes, or within the inner corridors of the temple complex itself. Some had watched their husbands and sons fall in battle. Others had been separated from their families during the chaos of the final assault and had no way of knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Now, as the dust of destruction settled, these women found themselves standing in long, sorrowful lines, surrounded by Roman legionaries who viewed them not as human beings with lives, histories, and families, but as the spoils of a hard-fought victory. In ancient warfare, prisoners were routinely treated as spoils of war. This was not unique to Rome, it was a brutal reality across the ancient world, but the Roman Empire had perfected the system with chilling efficiency. Roman soldiers were allowed and even expected to claim valuables, livestock, weapons, and sometimes even people as part of their reward for service. After a major conquest like the fall of Jerusalem, the division of spoils was conducted in an organized fashion, overseen by commanding officers who ensured that the empire itself received its share before individual soldiers claimed theirs. Human beings were categorized, assessed, and divided just as gold or grain might be. The young and strong were separated from the old and weak. Those deemed useful were kept. Those deemed worthless were often abandoned to die among the ruins. Many women were forced to march out of Jerusalem alongside thousands of other prisoners in long, winding columns that stretched across the dusty landscape of Judea. The journey was harsh and merciless. The captives walked for miles under the relentless Middle Eastern sun, with little water and almost no food. Guards on horseback rode alongside the columns, whipping those who stumbled and leaving behind those who could no longer walk. The roads that had once carried pilgrims to the holy city now carried its broken people away from it, perhaps forever. Some women carried infants in their arms, desperately trying to keep their children alive during the grueling march. Others walked in stunned silence, their eyes hollow with grief, their feet bleeding on the rocky ground. Some captives were taken to Roman military camps that had been established around the outskirts of Jerusalem during the siege. These camps served as processing centers where prisoners were sorted and assigned their fates. Others were transported to nearby cities under Roman control, such as Caesarea Maritima, the grand Roman administrative capital on the Mediterranean coast. In Caesarea, prisoners were sometimes held in large enclosures near the amphitheater, where some would later be forced to participate in brutal public spectacles for the entertainment of Roman citizens and soldiers. For many captives, the future was terrifyingly uncertain. They had no rights, no legal protections, and no voice. Their lives were entirely in the hands of their captors, and their fates depended on decisions made by men who saw them as commodities rather than people. Some women were sold into slavery in distant provinces of the vast Roman Empire. Slave markets existed in nearly every major Roman city, and the influx of thousands of Jewish captives after the fall of Jerusalem flooded these markets with human merchandise. Others were kept as household servants in the homes of Roman officers, senators, or wealthy citizens. Still others were condemned to forced labor, working in fields, quarries, or workshops under brutal conditions that often shortened their lives dramatically. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from the misty shores of Britain in the north to the scorching deserts of North Africa in the south, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the ancient lands of Mesopotamia in the east. Captives from Jerusalem could end up virtually anywhere within this enormous territory. A woman who had grown up within sight of the temple might find herself serving in a Roman villa in Gaul, grinding grain in an Egyptian workshop, or standing on an auction block in the heart of Rome itself. These women were no longer citizens of their own land. They had become part of the enormous, dehumanizing human trade that followed many Roman military victories, a trade that stripped them of their identity, their heritage, and their humanity, reducing them to entries in a merchant's ledger, mere property to be bought, sold, and discarded at will. Inside the Roman camps that surrounded the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem, the lives of prisoners were controlled completely, absolutely, and without mercy by their captors. The camps themselves were built with the precision and discipline for which the Roman military was renowned: neat rows of tents, organized supply lines, defensive perimeters, and guard posts stationed at every entrance and exit. But for the thousands of prisoners held within these camps, this order and discipline translated into something entirely different: total confinement, constant surveillance, and the complete erasure of personal freedom. Every movement was watched, every action was monitored, and every attempt at resistance was met with swift and brutal punishment. Food was limited and barely sufficient to sustain life. The prisoners received the lowest quality rations: stale bread, thin gruel, and occasionally small amounts of water that were never enough to fully quench their thirst under the harsh Judean sun. Many captives had already been weakened by the months-long siege that had preceded the fall of Jerusalem, during which starvation had ravaged the city's population. Josephus himself recorded horrifying accounts of the famine inside the besieged city, describing how people had eaten leather, grass, and even worse to stay alive. Now, in the camps, these already emaciated survivors were given just enough sustenance to keep them alive, not out of compassion but because dead prisoners had no economic value. A living captive could be sold, traded, or put to work. A dead one was worthless. The conditions within the camps were harsh beyond description. Prisoners were crowded together in open enclosures or cramped holding areas with little protection from the elements. The days were scorching hot, and the nights brought bitter cold. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, and disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded groups of captives. Dysentery, infection, and fever claimed lives daily, and the bodies of those who perished were dragged away without ceremony or dignity. The smell of death lingered constantly in the air, mixing with the smoke that still drifted from the destroyed city on the horizon. For those who survived, every day was a battle against physical deterioration, emotional despair, and the ever-present shadow of death. And through all of this, fear was the most constant companion of every prisoner. Fear of what would happen next. Fear of being separated from the few remaining family members they had managed to stay close to. Fear of being singled out by a soldier. Fear of the unknown future that awaited them in some distant corner of the Roman Empire. This fear was not abstract or distant. It was immediate, visceral, and unrelenting. It lived in every heartbeat, every whispered conversation, and every sleepless night spent staring into the darkness. Some women tried desperately to protect younger girls, shielding them from the attention of soldiers by hiding them in the center of groups, covering them with ragged clothing, or keeping them close at all times. Mothers held their daughters tightly, grandmothers wrapped their arms around granddaughters, and women who had lost their own children transferred their protective instincts to the vulnerable young ones around them. This silent solidarity among the women captives was one of the few sources of strength in an otherwise hopeless situation. Others tried to stay close to surviving relatives: a sister, a cousin, an aunt, finding small comfort in the presence of someone familiar in a world that had become utterly foreign and terrifying. Some women chose a different strategy for survival: silence and invisibility. They kept their heads down, avoided eye contact with guards, spoke as little as possible, and tried to make themselves unnoticeable. In a world where attracting attention could lead to the worst imaginable consequences, invisibility became a survival mechanism. War in the ancient world rarely followed modern rules of humanity. There were no Geneva Conventions, no international laws governing the treatment of prisoners, no humanitarian organizations monitoring the conduct of armies. Soldiers often acted with little restraint, governed only by the commands of their officers and frequently by their own impulses. This was especially true in cities that had resisted Roman rule, where the fury of conquest was compounded by the frustration of prolonged resistance. Jerusalem had resisted fiercely during the First Jewish-Roman War, which had lasted from 66 to 70 CE. The Jewish defenders had fought with extraordinary courage and determination, inflicting significant casualties on the Roman forces and prolonging the siege far beyond what Roman commanders had anticipated. Because of this fierce resistance, the Roman army treated the city with exceptional harshness after its fall. The destruction was not merely military, it was punitive. The burning of the temple, the systematic demolition of the city's walls, and the brutal treatment of its population were all intended to send an unmistakable message. The destruction of Jerusalem and the suffering of its people became a warning to every other nation, city, and people across the empire who might dare to challenge Roman power. For the women captured in Jerusalem, survival meant enduring a world that had suddenly, violently, and irreversibly become cruel and uncertain. A world in which their humanity meant nothing, and their endurance meant everything. The story doesn't end here. The second part reveals what happened next. So make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for part 2.